Welcome to the BTS Presents show.
I'm Brian Shulman, I'm the producer. We're currently doing segments on Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate behind the scenes. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Candace Bradfield, broker and owner of Bradfield & Associates and past president of our Santa Cruz County Association of Realtors. I want to thank you for joining BTS Presents.
Hi, welcome to BTS Presents. I'm Brian Shulman, tonight's host. Today we're doing Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate behind the scenes episodes, and we have today with our show Cynthia Berger and Robert Norse. So who'd like to go first, and what thoughts do you have about housing in Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley?
Let the rent control person do it.
Okay,
first.
great. Okay.
Well, my name's Cynthia Berger, and I'm a tenant organizer and a tenant activist and a tenant advocate and a tenant counselor. So I'm not a housing advocate, I'm a tenant advocate. It's a little different. And my group is called Santa Cruz Tenants Association. I founded it 4 years ago and I have the only bilingual hotline for tenants to call and find out what their rights are in the county. And I also have a website, which is santacruztenants.weebly.com. And my number is 831-222-0359. That's the hotline number.
I see you brought a whole lot of notes and things
Yeah.
you wanted to say, and I know that you're very busy with what's going on with Measure M, so please go ahead and
All right,
say
great.
whatever you need to say.
I wanted to address some talking points that are not accurate that have been going around and clear them up. One of them is that once the ballot measure, if it were to pass, it could not be passed unless there were a 2/3 vote. Well, 2/3 vote standard applies to tax laws. It doesn't apply to this kind of law. So 50% plus one voter gets it changed if they would so desire, if it gets passed. So I just want to clear that up.
I heard earlier this week that there was a discussion about whether to repeal it after it was passed. It would require a 2/3 vote, and that was quite a different scenario than they originally discussed.
They're making a lot of stuff up that are lies. And so the fact of the matter is, if you don't repeal it, you make a new charter amendment. If it's passed by a 50+1 standard, then if you want to change that charter amendment, then you need a 50+1 standard.
So
it's
originally
not about repealing, it's about changing the
But originally
charter.
they said, like a couple of months ago, that it was going to require 2/3 to
Who
change
said?
it. The city or the proponents against it, or it depends.
The city attorney has sent out a letter, which I had seen, answering that question, and he said 50% plus one.
Correct. That's the new information that I heard earlier this week. That I confirmed.
So
Okay,
that's the
great.
correct information.
Good.
So it can really put the other, whatever people were saying months ago that was incorrect, to bed, because it's being constantly dredged up and it's convincing people every day, and it's just a lie.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I've asked you to be here, is
and
to
I
try to
appreciate that.
get accuracy in the marketplace about what the facts are.
Yeah. So another issue that's come up a lot is subleasing. So there's some limits on subleasing that are new in our ballot measure. They limit the landlord's ability to evict for good cause when 3 conditions are met. And this is in section 5A2, capital A, of the ballot measure.
Measure M, correct?
Measure M, correct. So there are 2 different situations that can occur. A roommate can replace a departed tenant, or a tenant could sublet their entire apartment or home. In the case of roommates replacing other roommates, an original tenant, these 3 conditions have to be met, and the landlord will have an ability to evict for good cause. It will limit their ability to evict for good cause if these conditions are met, So if it's an original tenant who's on the lease contract and they continue to reside in the unit as their primary residence. That's condition 1. Condition 2, the sublease replaces 1 or more departed tenants on a 1-to-1 basis. That's condition 2. The condition 3, the landlord unreasonably withheld the tenant's request to sublease including occupancy levels.
When you say unreasonably, what do you mean by
Well,
that?
reasonable and unreasonable are legal terms.
I see.
They're defined by the judge or they're defined by whoever. Those are just legal terms and they're used all the time
Okay.
in tenant law. For example, a landlord has to fix something within a reasonable amount of time. They don't
Whatever that-
specify the exact period.
So one of the things that I've heard regarding this discussion subject is that a person who is leasing a space can bring in numerous family members and visitors and allow them to take upon residency in the property, and then they can leave, and then all those other people can be grandfathered into the property lease. Can you speak to that if there's anything that you'd like to say about that?
So the law in Santa Cruz is much more restrictive than the law in San Francisco as to what family members may be brought in on your lease. And there are occupancy levels that I think people have to comply with. And so yes, they may bring in certain family members, and so then they're not on the street homeless. That's good for the city. And
Okay, I just wanted to let you know
the second part
that
of your question was,
well, understanding that
issue
one
was-
of the things that I've heard, which may or may not be accurate, is, say, for example, a space
Oh,
that
yes,
has
right.
500 square feet can have 50 people living in it.
well, that's just ridiculous. And so that's where reasonable applies. A reasonable standard under the law applies. These things are not prescribed by how many people per square foot. You know, some people would like to interpret what they read in the fair housing laws in that way, but that's not how it goes when you go to a judge or a rent board. It's about reasonable, and it also it involves the age of the house and the condition of the house and the fragility of the house. There's a lot of things that can come into play.
Okay.
So another thing is that if you have someone that you brought in on a sublease and the person whose primary residence it is, the tenant on the lease, they move out, that subletter, they have a right to stay there until the end of the lease. That's it.
Correct.
After that, they can be evicted.
I see.
Yeah, and that's pretty much how it is sometimes currently. The law's murky. This makes the law really firm. The law's murky because I've had subtenants call me, oh, I didn't know I was illegal, and
Because
they
the
get
lease
some
ended and they
extra
were still
time.
living in there.
Yeah, they are often given extra time.
And
so in
one
this
more
case,
one more thing before we go on to Robert Norse for a moment, but what about when a person is staying past the end of the lease and a landlord wants to evict them? I understand there's some just cause evictions along with the tenant rights that are being considered that go along with these ordinances of Measure M.
if a landlord, the end of a lease is not a just cause for eviction. So is that what you're asking? No, it's absolutely not just cause for eviction, because we have laws in this state that say, oh, let's see, when you kick somebody out, you can kick somebody out whenever you want, and when you kick them out, you can raise the rent to the sky. We're changing that. The tenants are changing that, city by city. That's just not going to happen when you've got so many homeless people, you've got extremely high rents, and you've got to keep people housed.
So
So,
does
they
the-
have to not just be evicted whenever the landlord feels like it. Yes,
Well, at the end of a
landlords
lease,
don't like that.
but the end of a lease is the end of a contract, so wouldn't that be the terms of an agreement, that the agreement is ended and the terms end and therefore the tenancy ends?
This has been through the courts in California many times. It's been litigated. It's all settled law.
Cynthia, I've got a
You can put a
We'll be right there, Robert.
just cause the end of a lease. It's not a just cause to evict someone.
Okay.
The landlord no longer is going to have full, rights to kick people out as they do now. Yes, it's true.
Okay, we'll come back to that in just a second.
The
Robert,
question
go
I
ahead.
have is regarding this.
And by the way, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about HUFF, the organization you're
Sure, I
representing?
can, but I've got a question
Of
that
course,
she has
of course.
about what you were saying a moment ago, which is the landlord required to create a new lease at the end of the landlord can change the lease once the leasing period is ended, isn't that correct?
The landlord can. The landlord can change the material terms of the lease. They just, if they're covered by rent control, they will not be able to raise the rent higher than whatever the limit is. And
Is it
when you
3%
raise
a year?
it's
Or is it
it's
cost of
it's
The CPI?
yeah,
Yeah.
the CPI.
Consumer
So- Consumer Price Index of the San Francisco Bay Area,
Right.
that particular.
So
Consumer
whatever
Price
that goes
Index.
up is the amount that the rent can go up.
Yeah, if you're covered by rent control. At the
Correct.
moment, at this moment, there are buildings that can and can't be covered by rent
Is that because of
control.
Costa-Hawkins or some of
Yes.
the terms? All right,
Yes,
we'll talk a
because
little
of
bit about that in a minute, but
Yeah.
let's go back to Robert so he can
Right.
do a nice
Well, it's-
introduction.
I will in a moment.
Okay, back
Again,
to you
I'm
again.
still trying to
Yeah.
nail down this point, which is your concern, I think, Brian. That
Not
at
my
least-
concern, just
no,
something I
the
mentioned.
one that the concern of some
Okay.
that you presented
Correct.
Yeah.
was, well, you're stuck with, it goes on indefinitely, you can't get out of the lease. But in fact, the landlord can change the lease if she or he wants.
You can change
After the end of the lease or
At the
during
end
the
of the
terms
lease.
of the lease?
At
No.
the end of the lease.
At the end
You
of the
can
lease.
change a lease during as well, but the tenant has to sign off to it because it's a contract.
Right.
So you have to give a tenant 30 days notice if you want to change lease terms.
Right.
If you want to
Which is
change
contract law.
Yeah, and if you want to change lease terms at the end of the lease, the same thing applies.
Correct. You give them 30 days,
Yeah,
they
and
consider
you-
the terms, and if they
Yeah.
do or they don't,
And
then
you
they...
absolutely can, and if they don't sign it, then that is a just cause for eviction, is it not?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's a just cause for eviction. It might be an agreement
It's in
to...
the law.
I was thinking that it might be an agreement to terminate a lease.
It's in the law. If you do not sign a lease, then you may be evicted.
Correct,
It's in
because it's
yeah.
contract law, which is not something that we are
Right.
choosing to agree to. It's the terms of legal precedent.
Right, so both people have to agree.
Okay.
So if the tenant doesn't agree, I do believe they may be evicted at that point because the contract has lapsed.
Well, we can bring a
Yeah.
lawyer to the discussion and get more
I already
accuracy.
checked it out with the
And we
lawyer.
have too. We've had Ed Fry come and be on the show as well, and he's talked a little bit about these things.
Yeah, well, I work with rent control specialists.
I'm sure you do,
that-
and we
they
appreciate
just-
all the work you're doing. But please, Robert, can you do a little introduction of yourself so we can make
Certainly.
sure to
Why
get
not?
that?
I like to do that.
Okay, great.
I'm Robert Norse, and I work with a group called Homeless United for Friendship and Freedom, which tenants are likely to become homeless under the current situation. Even homeowners can become homeless and have.
Great.
Housing for for homeless people is a tent or a shelter or a car often. And so in a way, we're trying to stick with the topic of the show, which has to do with housing for really very poor people. Which,
No, housing for all people.
yeah, but in this case, I'm talking about a particular segment of the community.
Correct.
And because that's a subject I'm more familiar with. I can't really speak a lot to what Cynthia has been talking about or what your absentee landlord figure who may or may not show up during this broadcast.
Let's describe other people as other experts and
As those
other real
other-
estate professionals.
Right, or those on the other side of this dispute.
Not other side, just
Well, there are two sides to this measure.
no.
of dispute.
As I've been told by one of the people on city council who rides a bicycle, that there are many different sides of a discussion, not just two.
In this case, you vote yes or no on the measure. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, yes. In this situation, I'm concerned, as I talked to you about earlier, with what happened at the city council. Here's a,
Here, why don't Lim,
this
pass
is
it over.
this is a presentation that the city council
Thank you.
made available at its last meeting. What they did was they claim to have expanded what's called winter shelter. Every winter, the weather gets colder, and they've had, last winter, about 110 people had options to get into shelter out of a population of, I don't know, 1,000 to 2,000 homeless people. So it's only a fraction. But this winter, this is no longer possible. And at the same time, the city council is claiming it has expanded winter shelter. And this is something that is, I think, really misleading. In fact, I would even say a deliberate hoax.
Well, let's take a look at what this says actually.
Sure.
Expand the River Street camp by 20 tent sites to
Correct.
accommodate up to 75 to 80 individuals who are in large part sleeping outside. Expand the HSC Paul Lee Loft by 20 shelter beds to accommodate up to 60 individuals. Expand access to hygiene services. Expand and diversify shelter capacity by supporting a safe parking program to include 50 parking spaces. So, you want to pass that back? What is it about that you find
Well, this is
not
not
misleading?
all these three programs that you mentioned.
Well, I didn't mention it. I just read what the...
Right, well, that's what you were referring to.
Okay.
There's the Paul Lee Loft, which you can't get into on a walk-in basis. There's a waiting list. It's not like a winter shelter where you can knock on the door and say, I'm cold, sign me up for the night, I want to go in there. That's not the Paul Lee Loft, unless they're going to change the standards, and they haven't indicated that they will.
Well, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is the removal of the winter shelter is one thing, and the expansion of three other aspects is another. But you're saying that you think that the removal of the winter shelter is unacceptable, or
No, there is no winter shelter in the sense that you can walk in and get winter shelter,
Okay.
as has been the case for 25 years or since.
And where was
1980.
that winter shelter, and who managed it, and who
Well,
provided it?
last year it was the Association of Faith Communities that managed it at the Salvation Army and at the Veterans Hall at the edge of town.
Correct.
A couple years ago it was the Armory. It was managed by the homeless, what I call the homeless lack of
And
services
how many people
center.
do you think were using that on a daily basis as an average?
Well, they averaged about, I think, somewhere between 50 and 100.
Okay, so let's say there's 50 to 100 people that were using that on an average, and those.
None of them can use these services.
Right, but are there 50 or 100 spaces for people now somewhere else during the winter?
No.
Well, what about what Brent Adams has provided for?
He hasn't provided, he has a warming center,
warming
which is
center.
open, last winter was open, I think, less than 10 nights
But
out
it
of the
is-
entire winter.
Well, but it's open when the temperature reaches a level that requires winter assistance, if I understand the terms.
To who?
Disabled people,
whom?
elderly.
I don't know. I don't use it, so I don't know
Disabled
the
and
terms of that.
elderly people need assistance every night. They don't need it on, when the temperature drops. They particularly need it when the temperature drops below 30.
Okay.
But the fact of the matter is, to claim that that's some sort of solution to the situation or that they're getting it when they need it simply isn't true.
I hope you don't think I said that.
I thought I heard you say it, but
No, what
I'm
I said
I'm
was
glad to
it
be
has
corrected.
it has terms that the winter warming center is open during
The
certain.
warming center is not a city-funded program.
Correct.
It is a place that some private individuals have put together for a very few number of nights.
Okay.
The city has refused to support it, whereas the winter shelter program has been a nightly activity.
Okay, so what do you think the reason for removing the winter shelter is, according to what you heard being mentioned? Because I haven't looked into the details.
Well, it's a real interesting question. I don't have the answer to that question. This was just dropped upon us at the last Tuesday City Council
Was
meeting.
there anything else about HUFF or yourself or your organization that you're representing you'd like to say before we go back to Cynthia?
My concern is that the people realize that there is no walk-in winter shelter this winter, and therefore what they're doing is they're getting $30 million, and they're not expanding or even restoring the winter shelter that they had last winter. Instead, they're expanding these programs, which actually are fund magnets for the federal funding, because you need a pathway to housing to get into them.
So let me ask you one more question before we go back to Cynthia. If you think about this from a larger perspective than just Santa Cruz City, and we look at it from a Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley and San Francisco, the marketplace, and all the way down to Carmel and Big Sur, are you noticing a trend or a discussion that's in the larger perspective that's not just about Santa Cruz City and these three small programs, which are important?
Well, I've
but
not
small?
heard that they've eliminated winter shelter, which has always been a token effort. I got to make that really clear. In other words, it's not a big deal for the majority of people outside. The real issue for people outside is, will they be arrested for putting up their own tents and their own shelter in Santa Cruz? Will their tents be taken away? Will their property be seized by Parks and Rec and Santa Cruz police officers? These are the issues for homeless people. But in answer to your question, I'm not aware that any other jurisdiction has cut back winter shelter in this way.
Okay.
It's peculiar, and I don't quite understand.
Okay, well,
the
let's get some
rationale.
more information. We could talk about it either offline or we could talk about it a little bit farther later. If you don't mind, let's go
Not
back
at
to
all.
Cynthia. Please, let's continue with some of the things you wanted to talk about.
Okay, thank
Measure-
you. I
measure M's.
appreciate the time. So another issue that's come up is a lot of concern about the rent board, and one concern in particular.
The cost of the rent board, $300,000 to pay for a rent board to manage the rent control?
Every city has a rent board, and very few of them are in debt. So I think that the rent board can set their own budget and run it well. I don't have any concerns about that because I've studied the other cities, and the ones that started recently, they've paid back the monies that they used for starting up their however many hundreds, thousands, or millions it is. Santa Cruz is a small city. It should be costing less because there will be fewer units to deal with and fewer landlords to deal with, very fewer landlords at the rate the market's going right now, as it's all concentrating. So anyway, one concern that came up was that any base rent in a new construction would be set by the rent board and would be arbitrary. And so I want to address
So that's what
that
was
issue.
said, and you want to try to clarify that.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so unfair limitations by the rent board to new rents would precipitate fair returns petitions because landlords have a right under the measure to maintenance of net operating income, to maintain their net
Let's talk
operating
about what
income.
net operating income is. And I'm a mortgage banker, and you can find my mortgage information at 123 Loans by BTS.com. We could talk a little bit about financing available, but I can just let you know that when you think about net operating income, one of the things that I've heard being discussed is, let's say somebody has received a property and there's no mortgage on it and it's been grandfathered into their estate from years ago when their grandfather bought a property. Now they have no mortgage on it and they have no expenses on it other than taxes and upkeep and maintenance. The net operating cost for that property would be lower than somebody else who buys a brand new $1.5 to $2 million house on Cliff Drive and then wants to rent it, and they have a huge mortgage of a jumbo loan over $1 million, $1.5 million. Could somebody get the door, please? $1.5 million, and then that person has a high expense and their net operating cost is a lot higher. Is the rent board going to consider that those two properties don't necessarily have the same expense, the same income?
So unfair limitations by a rent board, as I was saying, would precipitate fair returns petitions by the landlords, either landlord. If it was unfair, they would petition the rent board. Such petitions would be predicted by the rent board. There would be no base year to set the maintenance of net operating income for a new construction.
Can you explain that other than in the terms of that?
It's a new building. You can't maintain a rent that was never changed before. So it's a new building, it hasn't been rented before. So it doesn't have a record of what it needs to maintain its net operating income. So of course, someone has to set the initial rent. And it
you're
has
saying
to
the rent board would do that?
They have the option to do that. Yes.
And then the tenant or the landlord would then have the option to petition that if it doesn't seem reasonable.
Absolutely. And the rent board would take into consideration, as would the landlord, in section A11, little a 3. It would be practically and legally difficult for the rent board to take such action. What would be the maintenance standard? If a landlord petitions the city and they pay all those legal costs for a lawyer to do that, on top of all the expensive land and the building, what might happen is that the petitions could result in a higher, in even less affordable rents than they originally planned for being set. So it's a reasonableness standard here.
Correct. We're back to reasonableness again.
So does the rent board want to set even higher rents because they went through the formula and that's what they came out with? No. And does the landlord want to set a higher rent that nobody can afford? No. So that's the answer to that. It's just really not going to happen.
Well, I must say that it's a pleasure to have both of you here. I think we're going to take a break and we'll come right back and we'll see what changes we're going to make to our discussion. Okay? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Datta Khalsa. I am hosting the second half of our installment, a discussion on rent control with our two guests. So good to be here with both of you.
Well, thanks for having us again.
Yeah, so Cynthia, I understand you're one of the authors of the rent control ballot.
Well, we had 4 citizen authors and we consulted with a team of rent control specialist lawyers also. So, yes.
Okay. How long was it, the process of putting it together?
It took us about 5 months of a lot of long 6-hour meetings to put it together. You studied a number of other rent control measures. Any particular ones that were of the most influence? Well, I personally studied a lot, and I wouldn't say the group studied a lot, but we studied different parts of different measures. But I was very interested when rent control passed in 2016 in Richmond and Mountain View, and so I actually went up there and I spoke with those people and I studied theirs because they were the latest iterations of rent control, and I found the Richmond ordinance had a lot of protections that I thought would be good to include in our law, but we wrote something specifically for our city. It's specific. Every rent control law is different. Right. So we wrote one that we felt addressed this particular issues in Santa Cruz, which is one of the most expensive cities with the lowest wages. So we tried to make something to address the issues that come up in that situation. So some of the more controversial parts of it center around the just cause eviction portions of the measure. So what was the thinking in including those? Well, rent control is not worth anything without just cause for eviction, because you can just be rent raised right out of your place and you can be evicted for no cause in the state of California. So there's no point in going through the process of making a rent control law without just cause for eviction. There's no benefit to the tenant for that.
What about the paradox of, say, the Ellis Act, where a landlord basically says, well, this isn't making sense for me anymore, so I'm going to withdraw my property from the rental market for 10 years. Do you think there's a potential for consequence of that that's happened in other cities? Do you see that potentially being a problem here?
There are many consequences that can be brought on by the landlord lobby passing laws at the legislative level, because they have a lot of financial, they have a lot of punch at that level. Thank you. And we just are trying to pass laws that are fair for tenants and keep our communities, have a community standard that includes renters and tenants in what's valuable to a community. So we didn't make those laws that are trying to pull rent control apart. Landlords passed the Costa-Hawkins Act and the Ellis Act, and that doesn't mean we're going to stop passing rent control laws because all is lost. We're not going to wring our hands and slink off into the
well, no, it's definitely
Central Valley. We have to fight, and so we will put new things in our laws, and they will pass through the courts, and they will get tighter and tighter, and then landlords will fight back, and so it's an ongoing process.
Yeah,
right.
No, I think affordability is definitely a good cause. I mean, I have a lot of friends and even people who are in the real estate industry, because little known fact, probably 10% of the agents make 90% of the income. So you have people in the real estate industry who are often seen as siding with the landlords when many of them are actually tenants. And the real paradox is finding the right mix of how you can control the basic, outside of a capitalist society, going beyond the basic motivation of being able to afford the high prices of houses, which then trickles down to the rents. And unless you can revoke the Ellis Act and Costa-Hawkins, which if I understand correctly, were passed in the wake of what happened for the 15 years from 1980 to 1995, where a high number of landlords basically left the business, developers left the business, and no more rental housing was developed. And so rents actually went up. And so in order to bring an incentive for these developers who have no reason to build here aside from if it's going to make them a profit, then they started to come back in 95. So it's such a complex thing. I really admire that you're going out there and doing what you think is going to make a difference. I'm doing the same thing. The fact that we differ on it, that's what makes this. I hate to say "Make America Great Again" because that sounds like some else. But what makes Santa Cruz a vital place is that people like you and me can sit down here and say, okay, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And hopefully each of us comes away with something we hadn't thought about.
And hopefully goes home to a place we can actually don't get rented out of.
Yeah, I love that vision, because we need people of all shapes, sizes, and all incomes.
But that's not what's happening now. That's the problem.
I know. I'm seeing a big change. So, talk about, if you will, what's your focus?
I was called in at the very last minute, perhaps in desperation because you were going to be late. I'm not sure. But my issue has to do with civil rights for homeless people, and to some extent services such as emergency shelter and the right to be left alone outside if you haven't got any shelter and you have to shelter yourself, which is a major problem in all kinds of cities up and down across the country and in California, but particularly in Santa Cruz. I mean, I've spent years denouncing the sleeping ban law in Santa Cruz, which is still on the books, which makes it illegal to be asleep after 11 o'clock at night. It's hard to work this into a housing discussion, but that for homeless people, tents are housing. Emergency shelter is housing. And before you came in, our previous host, Brian, I pointed out to him that the city council has got millions of dollars to spend, and it's essentially completely eliminating even the very inadequate winter shelter program it had last winter, and instead making token expansions to programs that you can't use for emergency shelter. Emergency shelter means, help, I need some help, let me in. Whereas these programs involve going through a vetting process, have to show you have a pathway to housing. It's you can't walk in on a cold night and get into these. You get on a waiting list.
Right.
So my interest and my concern has to do with that. And also I'm concerned with the impact of lack of rent control on creating homelessness in Santa Cruz, something that I've been urging rent control advocates to add to their armory, which they are to some extent. They're talking about it. You're likely to end up on the streets. Many people do. Right. It's true, I guess you can move away, but many people, rather than abandon the connections and the community connections that they have, will be homeless in their vehicles. They'll continue working here. And you probably had this experience yourself with people you've known if you've been around here for a while.
People that I've been very close to.
So in that regard, HUFF, Homeless United for Friendship and Freedom, the group I work with, is in solidarity with, if not critical on the left, around rent control. I mean, I'd like to see rent reduction, but right now we're on the bandwagon of being supportive of the rent control measures.
So are you active in San Francisco, for example, as well?
It's very local.
HUFF is a local organization?
Is a purely local Santa Cruz organization.
Because I know San Francisco is one of the first cities to do rent control, and they have, an equally daunting homeless issue. Ideologically, I would love to see something work. The problem that I see with the rent control is I haven't seen it work in other cities, New York City as well. I mean, their homeless shelters are open they're basically filled to capacity and then some. So the solutions I keep reading about have to do with ways of providing. So I think you're on the right path, trying to provide shelters, trying to provide.
See, I think it's misleading though to say
solutions.
Well, they're basically Band-Aids to a bigger problem. So
rent control isn't meant to address homelessness. It's not meant to address homelessness. That's not what it's about.
Okay.
And homelessness
rent control is meant to stabilize rents so that low income, people of color, women, and disabled people and senior citizens can remain in their community.
Right.
That's what it's about.
But
it's specifically
failed every time.
That's not because of rent control. That's because Costa-Hawkins was put into effect, as well as the Ellis Act. So, you've got your, and I'd like to do a whole other show on this, your data between 1980 and 1995. There are more sources than the ones you're using. So I think we could use a more full-length discussion. You made you posited some things as facts, but the people who do studies, those are housed people that have vested interests, and there have never been any studies done from the viewpoint of renters about rent control of any consequence. So you can't name me one. And so So are
you suggesting that if Costa-Hawkins is repealed and Ellis Act is repealed, that'll solve the problems?
No, I'm suggesting that your claim that a lot of rental housing was lost is due to rent control, is not due to rent control. Santa Cruz right now, the market here is more profitable than New York City. I've been talking to real estate agents.
Profitable?
Yes. The market here.
In terms of what, cap rate?
People are just buying up like huge amounts of real estate, like for example on Lower Frederick Street in that neighborhood. And so there's really not a problem selling real estate here because the market's very hot.
It's extremely hot for buyers.
Yes.
For buyers, we have people coming from Silicon Valley with seven-figure incomes.
And those are the people who don't really want rent control here, and they're paying a lot of money out through the California Apartment Association and other groups to make sure that their newly purchased properties, hopefully won't fall under rent control, because a lot of them bought before February 13th and had a plan. And the rent control put a wrench into some of those plans.
Well, I would love to talk it through further with you, because most of the people from Silicon Valley are buying to occupy, and they're displacing renters.
Well, there's many. Well, those are maybe
we need to have ways of constructing
from
more
Silicon Valley
high-density housing.
But there are people from all over the country buying here. There are large landlords buying here.
Not for profit. No, for profit.
Oh yes, for profit. For example, Hilltop. That used to be. It's over on Western Drive. It used to have a different name for many years, and it's called Hilltop now. It was bought by a Goldman Sachs-owned investment company. It's an apartment complex. People are investing here.
It's an apartment complex?
Because they see a place for profit.
It's an apartment complex.
It's one of the larger apartment complexes in the city. and it's on Western
Oh,
Drive.
the one at the top of Western there.
Yes.
Okay, I understand
yes.
that.
You know, when
yes.
you claim that rent control doesn't help homelessness, you know, if you look at the increase in homelessness throughout the country, you've got to consider that there are much more basic concerns that impact all of us, having to do with inequality of wealth, the war economy, all kinds of things that are not being addressed, corruption, massive corruption, and corporate power that simply doesn't take into account the concerns of renters, the concerns of poor people, and doesn't create the kinds of services that actually might, and the kinds of housing, as you know, that might create.
Well, I think you've tapped on something, creation of housing being a key one. We have to go to a video right now, but let's talk about that more in terms of solutions where we could add. I would love to see low-income rental, low-income purchasing of housing. I've spoken to several of those people, you know, increasing the supply. And so we'll be back after this video. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Robert Singleton. I'm the campaign director for Santa Cruz Together, and we're here at our campaign kickoff. It's August 22nd. Here about 7 p.m. in Stockwell Cellars. We're excited to be here. We have around 150 people on our side here to celebrate the beginning of this campaign. We're excited because Measure M, we feel, will be dramatically impactful to the housing market. And renters like myself will be disproportionately harmed given the way the economics are working. So we're happy to be here. We are No One Measure M, and so we are a coalition of local homeowners, renters, students, teachers, from all walks of life who are here who believe this measure will ultimately be detrimental to the housing market in Santa Cruz.
What can you say about the people behind you that are in the opposition? What are your concerns about that perspective, or what can you say about the fact that you have another group of people behind you with a different perspective than you have?
I don't have a lot to say. They're entitled to their opinion. I believe their intentions are really good. I think we all want the same thing, which is a Santa Cruz that's affordable for a large collection of people. It's just we disagree about how to get there. And so while they may have disagreements, they're welcome to speak their mind. You know, we're glad that they're passionate and involved in this issue. We look forward to being able to engage in an educational discussion from this point on.
All right, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Hi, we're here with Keshav Kumar at the Measure M event at Stockwell Cellars.
We are here today because we are standing against the rent control measure that's going to be on the ballot in November, because we think it will be far too costly and far too wasteful to our city. We believe that there are many solutions to finding affordable housing in Santa Cruz, and band-aids like this aren't going to do the trick. We need to make sure that we're working together as a community to create a cohesive solution that actually makes sure that all constituents of the city are served. And so this solution is frustrating to us because it only serves a small minority of people in our city. So I am standing here as a volunteer and as a canvasser because I do not believe Measure M is the solution.
What do you think about outside of the Santa Cruz County area about the whole issue of rent control nationally or locally?
I think the Stanford study is the only thing I really need to cite here, because it proves, and there are many studies like it, that the city of San Francisco did not benefit from rent control. And the entire economics department at my university, University of California, Santa Cruz, is against this measure. So there's quite a bit of academic proof that rent control doesn't work. Outside of Santa Cruz, this will be the most extreme version of rent control. And so I don't see this working out any better than it did in the outside cases that we've seen.
What can you say about the people behind you that are protesting your position? Because clearly they have a different perspective than you.
They're passionate individuals who believe that we need a solution to affordable housing to make sure that people can stay in this area. I respect the passion, but at the same time, I do not believe band-aid solutions like Measure M are the solution.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
And a renter here in Santa Cruz. I first became interested in working in politics because of my interest in fairness and human rights, which is something, because I live here in Santa Cruz, California, immediately led me to working on the housing crisis. It is also something that may get you to beg the question of why I am in here talking to you and not outside. That is because Measure N is not a policy that will help Santa Cruz. It will not help landlords, yes, but it will also not help renters, individuals experiencing homelessness, or do anything to address California's most prevalent issue, the lack of affordable housing.
We've started canvassing early this month. Robert has an excellent team of trained canvassers out there every day. The thing that is fantastic about it is that they are young renters that recognize that this is bad for the future of rental housing in Santa Cruz. So we have young renters canvassing daily. We would like to have additional canvassers. So again, opportunity for everybody to help us out. There'll be a training this weekend at noon at Cruz that Robert.
Saturday noon.
Our website traffic doubled in August to about 3,500 unique visitors so far. So the website is doing extremely well. And I want to encourage everybody to realize that part of the way that we're organizing and mobilizing is from the website. So if you have people interested, send them to the website, have them read about it, have them join our email list, and then also on the website you can, people other than you guys who are now know what's going on, they can get a yard sign, they can endorse off the website. So we want people to go there. So it's good to be aware, but I think then they can also be part of the newsletter, figure out what the volunteer opportunities are. So we are, one of the things that is fantastic about us is we have a really good network effect because we have so many people, and you can all tell your friends, drive them to the website, we're just going to make this thing bigger and bigger.
You can actually see the data.
Let's hear it. So,
All right, I have to say
This is
goodbye.
oh wait, well, not quite so quick.
I'll give you my card.
So we are back, as you can see from literally people on the streets over this issue. It is a very hot issue right now, and I really am grateful to our two guest panelists today for sharing their views. Again, while we don't always see eye to eye, I think we all see eye to eye that it is a very clear and real issue. So, Robert, if you want to speak a little bit about just any kind of closing comments regarding where your focus is, what you would like to see ideally happen.
Is this going to be broadcast shortly? What's the broadcast?
Within probably the next 2 weeks.
Well, the concern that a number of us have been working on is reopening facilities that are obviously vital for basic community health and also for that of people who are disabled, senior, elderly, outside.
And we're talking about the Harvey West facilities?
I'm talking about the Loudon Nelson bathrooms, for example, that's been locked. It's an anti-homeless mentality that goes along with the gentrification process that I think is creating a lot of the problems that this Measure M is trying to at least address in some limited way. The organization I work with, HUFF, Homeless United for Friendship and Freedom, is concerned with restoring civil rights and services to homeless folks, particularly civil rights.
Yeah.
And that's, if people are interested, they can contact the numbers on the screen, 423-HUFF, 423-4833. That's the number to call if you're interested in these issues.
Thank you very much.
You're
And
welcome.
Cynthia, I understand you've got to get to your day job, so to speak.
I
Not
do,
exactly
yeah.
your job,
So
but
sorry I have to leave, but thank you so much for having me.
I would definitely welcome you back anytime. And offline, we're going to share some data. And I think both of us want to make sure that if we're out there being vocal, trying to make a difference, that we're doing it on correct data. So I think that's a wonderful.
That's always a
cause.
good idea. So
Yeah.
I'm with Santa Cruz Tenants Association. I have a website, santacruztenants.weebly.com, and I have an email, santacruztenants@gmail.com, and the Tenants' Rights Hotline is 831-222-0359, and you can find me as a member of the Yes on M campaign coalition. We have a website, Facebook page, just Yes on M in Santa Cruz. You'll find all of our information and volunteer folks.
Great. And I guess just one closing thought. As I understand it, the City Council has a measure, a fallback measure, the 10%, 15% maximum rate increases that will take effect if Measure M doesn't pass. What are
Have
your
you
thoughts
seen
on
it?
I don't think the final's been drafted yet.
Where did you hear about it?
I've heard about it from David Terrazas, amongst others. They
He's the
do.
mayor.
Yeah, he is the mayor. Well, the outgoing. So any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think that Measure M is going to provide so many more protections that the council measure will pale in comparison, and it will be easily overturned unless it's being underwritten by the California Apartment Association, in which case it's really not any use. So what happens when a city council passes rent control? If it's really rent control, the next day the apartment and the landlord lobby, they hire a company, a lot of times it's from Utah or other states, they come in, they gather signatures, they overturn that however they need to. And so it's pointless, and it can be changed by another administration.
Yeah, this particular one, as I understand it, CAA standards dictate that it's inhumane to raise rents by more than 10%. So it seems to mirror in some ways that. So my hope would be that, and my expectation would be that CAA would actually be okay with this, but I don't know. I'm not on the inside.
I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. But the issue is that the rents are already exorbitant, and people are already paying 75% of their income many times, at least over 50. And so a 10% or a 9% or an 8% or a 7% rent raise is going to evict a lot of people right there. So that's no use at all in the kind of atmosphere we're in, the ambience of rents versus wages here. You just want to kick everybody out who works here and just have people living here who work in Santa Clara County where the wages are 60% more. I don't think we want to do that. So I don't understand, the logic.
The runaway home prices, actually a 10% increase wouldn't keep pace with the amount of increase that there have been in housing prices and in apartment prices.
Well, those people are speculators, so it's going to crash, and that's why there's a run right now, because the housing prices are going down right now a little bit, and things are selling in a shorter time than last year. That tells us something.
Whatever we come up with, hopefully there can be a little bit more supply, and it can be done in a way that doesn't completely change our community that we all love. So thank you.
Yeah, there is more supply when we allow people to bring in their family members. That keeps people off the streets, and that's what Measure M does, too.
Well.
That's
and
one way.
the hope is that we can get some developers excited about this county too, to provide some low-cost housing. So stay tuned, and thank you all for joining us. And again, we'll be in touch.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
You too.
Thanks for watching the BTS Presents show.